Part 1, Anna. The pain that turned into a promise. Some stories don't begin with grand events, but with silent prayers. And among all of them, Anna's is one of the most profound. Anna was not a famous woman. She wasn't a leader of anything. She had no titles, no influence, no recognition among the people around her. But she carried something that no social position can hide, a constant pain in her heart. She was infertile. Back then, it wasn't just a physical condition. It was a social sentence. It meant public shame, silent humiliation, and often suffering within one's own home. Hannah was the wife of Elkanah, a man who loved her. But there was another woman in the house, Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, and he made a point of reminding people of that. Every year, when the family went up to worship at the temple in Shiloh, Hannah felt the same weight. While Peninnah showed off her children, smiling with pride, Hannah carried the emptiness in her arms. Peninnah's words weren't always shouted. Sometimes they were just glances, other times subtle comments, but they always hurt. And Anna was crying, not just once, not two, but repeatedly. There were days when she couldn't eat. Days when he even distanced himself from festive occasions. Days when his silence was heavier than any words. And yet, Anna continued going to the temple. Because when the world offers no answers, the heart begins to search for God. It was on one of those trips that everything changed. While everyone was eating and celebrating, Anna went away. He entered the temple. And there, before the Lord, she did not give a beautiful speech. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't use elaborate words. She simply collapsed. She cried. And he prayed, "Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the affliction of your servant, and remember me." His prayer was no ordinary request. It was a total commitment. She didn't just want one child. She wanted to be remembered. She wanted her pain to have a purpose. The priest Eli watched from a distance and, seeing her lips move silently, thought she was drunk. But Anna wasn't drunk on wine. I was in a lot of pain, and devoid of human hope. When he confronted her, she responded with respect, but also with honesty. "I am not drunk. I am pouring out my soul before the Lord." There are times when human words cannot describe what the heart feels. And that was one of them. Eli, realizing her sincerity, replied with something that would change everything. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Anna didn't leave there transformed immediately. She didn't have the child yet. I still didn't have a visible answer. But something had changed inside her. Sadness was no longer empty. Now I had direction. And sometime after that prayer, the promise began to be fulfilled. Time passed. And Hannah conceived. Boy was born. And she named him Samuel. The Lord has heard. But Anna's story doesn't end at birth. Because the true weight of your choice came later. She had made a promise to God that day in the temple. If he were to receive the son, he would return him to the Lord. And now, with Samuel in her arms, she would need to keep her word. This is the part of the story that many people fail to understand. Because love is one thing. Giving up what you love for a purpose is something completely different. When Samuel was weaned, Hannah took him to the temple. Not like someone who hands over something worthless, but like returning a sacred gift. She didn't cry in despair. She did not back down. She did not renege on her promise. She gave up her son. And she loved it. That boy, born of pain and prayer, would grow up within the house of God. And he would become one of the greatest prophets in the history of Israel. A man who would guide kings. That he would hear the voice of God. That would change the destiny of a nation. But it all started with a mother who cried in silence. And she chose to trust even without understanding. Anna not only received a miracle, she delivered a purpose. And that makes her the first of 5 mothers who would change history. Not because of power, not through influence, but through faith. Continuation of Part 1. Anna. The silence that matures faith. Even after receiving the priest's promise, Anna did not see any immediate changes around her. Life continued as usual on the outside. Peninnah still had her children. trips to the temple still offered the same scenery. And God's silence continued to be a test for the heart. But something inside Anna was no longer the same. She was no longer carrying only pain. Now it carried purpose. And this changes the way a person navigates suffering. What was once despair is now hope. What was once emptiness was now confidence. God's timing, however, does not obey human rhythm. He works in depth, not in a hurry. And so, month after month, Anna was shaped by waiting. When Samuel was finally born, it was more than just a birth. It was a response. But it was also a reminder. Not every answer is the end of the journey. Sometimes, it's the beginning of a new responsibility. Samuel was more than just a son. It was a living promise. And Anna knew that. Therefore, her motherhood carried a different awareness from the very beginning. She didn't see Samuel as a possession, but as a mission. And that changes everything. In his early years, she raised him with love, protection, and constant presence. Each of his smiles was remembered as a gift. Every step was celebrated. But at every moment, there was also a silent wait. The day she would need to hand it over. This type of love is not common. Because it's a love that can't be confined. That which does not require control. Someone who doesn't try to hold on to what they know doesn't completely belong to them. When the time came for weaning, Anna prepared everything carefully. There was no rush. There was no escape. She knew exactly what she was doing. He took some offerings with him.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you'll receive 3 special bonuses today. The ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Words of gratitude. And the boy who was once just an impossible dream. Upon arriving at the temple, he handed Samuel over to Eli. And he said something that resonates as one of the most profound statements in all of history. I was praying for this child. There was no accusation. There was no regret. Just recognition. The pain that had turned into a miracle was now returning to its place of origin. Not as a loss, but as a consecration. And in that gesture, Anna taught something that transcends generations. Not everything that God gives is meant to be kept. Some things are given to fulfill a greater purpose. After that, Anna doesn't disappear from the story. On the contrary, she reappears in a song. One of the most beautiful expressions of gratitude in the Bible. There she doesn't just talk about herself. God speaks. Of the God who raises up the downtrodden. Of the God who brings down the proud. Of the God who sees the invisible. And this song is not just a prayer. It is a declaration of profound spiritual understanding. Anna understood something that many people only discover after years of pain. God does not ignore tears. He transforms them into history. And Samuel, his son, would grow up to be exactly that. An answer that would impact kings, nations, and generations. But it all starts here. With a woman forgotten in the eyes of the world. But remembered in heaven. A mother who cried. He prayed. He trusted. And he delivered. And that's why Anna is not just a character in the story. She is the beginning of a line of mothers that God used to change the course of humanity. Part 2, Ruth and Naomi. Faithfulness in the midst of loss. If Anna's story begins with the pain of waiting, Ruth's begins with the pain of loss. Ruth was not an Israelite. She was not part of the people of the promise. She came from Moab, a distant people with different customs and a history marked by separation. But it was precisely there, in the unlikely place, that God began to write a new part of this narrative. Ruth had married one of Naomi's sons, an Israelite woman who had left her land because of famine. For a time, it seemed that a life was being rebuilt in that new place. But death entered the story. First, Naomi's husband died. Then their 2 children. And so, 3 women were left alone. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. Without protection. No inheritance. No clear future. Back then, that meant total vulnerability. Orpha decided to return to her homeland, to her family of origin, to what little safety remained. But Ruth made a different decision. A decision that made no logical sense. A decision that stemmed not from calculation, but from loyalty. She said to Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you. For wherever you go, I will go." These words were not merely emotional. They represented a break with the past. Ruth was choosing to give up everything she knew in order to walk with a broken woman, without resources and without prospects. She didn't know what the future held. There were no guarantees. But he chose to stay. And that's something rare. Because most people only stay as long as there is something to gain. Ruth stayed when there was nothing else left. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the situation was even more difficult. Naomi was bitter. She herself said that she should be called Mara, because her life had become bitter. Ruth, on the other hand, began to work. She went to glean ears of grain in the fields, following what was permitted for the poor and foreigners. It was a humble job, exhausting, and often invisible. But it was there, in the invisible realm, that something extraordinary began to happen. The field she entered belonged to Boaz, an influential and righteous man. Boaz noticed Ruth, not just another worker, but as someone different. There was something about her posture, in humility, in dedication, in the way he cared for Naomi even in the midst of his own grief. He began to protect her. I instructed her to ensure she had enough food. What seemed like just a one-off favor began to turn into something bigger. Boaz became interested in her story, and he discovered her loyalty. Later, following the customs of the time, he assumed responsibility for her, becoming her rescuer. Ruth married Boaz, and she had a son. This son's name was Obed, and Obed would be David's grandfather, the most important king in the history of Israel, i.e., a foreign woman, a widow without social standing, entered the genealogy of the greatest king of an entire nation. And more than that, it entered the lineage of an even greater promise. But what makes Ruth special is not just the ending of the story. That's the way. Because it all started with a simple decision: to stay when it would be easier to leave. Taking care of things when there was no obligation to do so. To keep going when everything told you to give up. Ruth did not change the world through power. Changed with loyalty. And that loyalty opened doors she never imagined. She didn't know she was being inserted into a line of purpose that would span generations. But God knew. And that's what connects her story to Anna's. Women who had no control over the future, but had courage in the present. And now, the narrative approaches an even deeper point. A woman who neither trusted nor stayed. But she was chosen to carry the very fulfillment of the divine promise in the world. Part 3, Mary and Elizabeth. When the impossible enters the story, full version. If Hannah represents prayer born from pain, and Ruth represents faithfulness born from loss, Mary and Elizabeth represent the deepest point in this entire line. The moment when God enters human history directly, silently, and irreversibly. Isabel was already elderly. From a human perspective, her motherhood story had ended decades ago. Her body said the end, time said it's over, and logic said impossible. She was the wife of Zechariah, a righteous priest, also elderly, faithful in his.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you'll receive 3 special bonuses today: the ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Responsibilities before God. Both served in the temple, both prayed, both maintained a life of integrity, but they carried a silent absence that time never managed to fill. They had no children. And in that culture, it wasn't just a family condition. It was a constant social and emotional wound. Even so, they remained faithful. They continued serving. They continued to believe. Then, on an ordinary day of service at the temple, Zechariah had a vision. An angel appeared. And the message was simple, yet impossible. Isabel would have a son. And this son would have a specific purpose: to prepare the way for the Lord. Zechariah couldn't believe it. Doubt took hold of him. How will that be possible, he thought. And because of this doubt, he remained silent. Literally. He lost the ability to speak until the promise was fulfilled. That in itself is symbolic. Because there are times when God is working, but human beings need to learn to be still in order to see. And then it happened. Isabel became pregnant. Not as a result of human effort, but as a direct intervention of the supernatural. She who had carried years of waiting now carried life. And he isolated himself for a while. Not out of shame, but through contemplation. She knew that this was unusual. It wasn't natural. It wasn't predictable. It was promised. Meanwhile, elsewhere in history, in a simple town called Nazareth, a young woman named Mary lived her ordinary life. She was not socially prominent. He had no political power. Had no religious influence. She was a young woman betrothed to Joseph, a carpenter. His life was simple, organized, and predictable, until the unexpected became routine. The angel Gabriel appeared to her, and he said words that would change everything. "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God." And then came the revelation. She would conceive a child. And this son would be called Son of the Most High. He would inherit David's throne. And his kingdom would have no end. Maria didn't understand. And that's important. She didn't have all the answers. There was no social explanation. There was no guarantee of acceptance. He wasn't sure what Jose's reaction would be. He had no control over the future. She only had one choice: trust or refuse. And his answer changed history. "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word." This is not a statement of emotion. It's a phrase of conscious surrender. Maria was accepting something that would completely change her life, her reputation, and her future. She was saying yes to the invisible, yes to the unknown, yes to the risk, yes to God. A short time later, Mary traveled to visit Elizabeth. And when he entered the house, something extraordinary happened. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, she was filled with joy. And the baby in her womb, John, moved, as if recognizing something greater present there. Then Elizabeth, filled with the Spirit, declared, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." At this moment, two stories intersect. An elderly woman who received a late miracle, and a young woman who carried the greatest miracle of all. Two generations, two impossibilities, one same God. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for several months, and during that time something profound happened. The invisible began to take visible form. The promise began to take shape. The silence began to give way to greetings. And Mary sang a song, one of the most profound in history, the Magnificat. In it, she acknowledges that God doesn't just choose ordinary people. He transforms structures. He lifts up the humble. He brings down the proud. He fills in the gaps. And he fulfills ancient promises through unlikely lives. John's birth marked the beginning of the preparation. And the birth of Jesus marked the final fulfillment. But it all started long before that. It began with Hannah, who prayed. He passed by Ruth, who stayed. He arrived in Isabel, who waited. And it culminated in Mary, who responded. For women. For different stories. For distinct contexts. But a single invisible thread connects them all. Faith in the midst of the impossible. None of them had complete control over their own story. But they all decided to trust anyway. And that's what transforms these narratives into something greater than just old stories. They become role models. Because they remain relevant today. Even today there are people who pray without an immediate answer. Those who remain when everything tells them to leave. They wait when time seems to have run out. And they need to say yes to paths they don't fully understand. These 5 mothers are not just figures from the past. They are portraits of an eternal truth. God does not choose the strongest. He chooses the ones that are available. And when someone says yes, even without understanding, the story changes. Not just history itself, but it's the story of many. And so ends this series of women who, in different ways, carried something much greater than themselves. And they changed the world not with power, but with faith.